EMS3 Recombination says, "Hi Terry, I hope you're well." Yeah, I am. I've got a little bit of a rough throat, and I had a COVID test yesterday, and the results came back negative. And it was like a PCR, it wasn't just a rat test. So I am doing well, and I have a text message to prove it. EMS3 Recombination says, "I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on Nick Roeg's films. Do I have a favourite, least favourite, and why? Personally, I think his run of films from performance to bad timing are hard to beat. Cheers." Yeah, I like Nick Roeg's stuff. I think he was a fine filmmaker and a fine cinematographer as well. As a director, I like Walkabout, of course. Don't Look Now. Don't Look Now is one of the classics of cinema. No Way About It. Performance I kind of like, but I don't love. Man Who Fell to Earth, I kind of couldn't get past it. Now, I'm a science fiction buff. And the idea of an alien coming to Earth to look for water is kind of stupid because the solar system, and also probably any other solar system, are full of ice. I mean, there's ice all over the bloody solar system once you get out past Mars. And the idea of coming to another planet to look for water to carry back to your planet is stupid. And I couldn't overcome that when I watched Man Who Fell to Earth. I kind of like Insignificance. Insignificance, based on a play it was, is a weird film where you have a hotel room where Albert Einstein, Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe are together talking, and you've got Teresa Russell playing Marilyn Monroe, you've got Gary Busey playing DiMaggio, and you've got some other guy playing Michael Emile playing Einstein, and they kind of talk things around, and you get Marilyn Monroe explaining the theory of relativity. It's a fun little small film of Nick Roeg's that I really like. Let's have a look here, and as a cinematographer, you can't get past things like Mask of the Red Death, the Roger Corman one, to just loop back to Roger Corman there. Every Day's a Holiday is an interesting one as well. It's a musical comedy movie, which I kind of have a fondness for. Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Far From the Madding Crowd, fantastic looking film as well. He also did a Eurospy movie called Code 7 Victim 5 with Lex Barker, which is kind of weird. The idea of Nicolas Roeg doing a Eurospy movie is kind of wild. But yeah, I mean, there's not really a least favourite that I have, but those are the ones I like. I like Insignificance, I like Don't Look Now, I like Walkabout. Castaway's a weird one with Amanda Donohoe and Oliver Reed. That one is a bit of a weird one. But for me, those are my favourite Roeg ones. They're kind of the obvious choices in some ways, but I kind of like them. Cineboss says, also, what's the most horrific and completely bloodless movie ending you've seen? E.g. the ending of Frankenheimer's Seconds. Yeah, the ending of Frankenheimer's Seconds works. The one I came up with, which is kind of odd and is a bit left field, is a 2008 Australian horror film called Dying Breed, which has Lee Whannell as one of the actors in it. And the ending of that is horrible and horrifying and just totally off the rails bad for me. I mean, it's a movie that I won't watch again. I think it's a solid ending. I think it's a solid horror movie ending. But it's just too confronting for me. So the boss also says, excluding boxing movies, what's the best fight scene you've seen in a movie? Wow, you almost have to go back to people like Bruce Lee for that. I like the one in Enter the Dragon, the one in the mirror room with Han. Spartacus, the duel between Woody Strode and Kirk Douglas in Spartacus is next level good. I love that one. I think it has an emotional depth that really works, and it's been repeated a number of times. In fact, I read a comic the other day which kind of replays that in a different context. The chainsaw fight between Peter Carston and Rod Taylor in Darker the Sun's good, and the fight between William Smith and Rod Taylor in Darker Than Amber, which I want somebody to do a Blu-ray release of. Fantastic. They're both MGM movies, and the fight between William Smith and Rod Taylor in that is visceral and bloody and gory, and both of them were injured during the making of that fight scene, but it really works well. And also it's based on one of John D. MacDonald's Travis McGee novels, which I love, even though it does change it in a way that I'm not really good with. Darker the Sun and Darker Than Amber. Mogridge says, yes, I have one. Orson Welles movies. Why is the sound always off? When you watch Touch of Evil, Lady from Shanghai, it's very noticeable, but you can hear it in most of them. Othello is another example. It's as if the dubbing was not quite right. I wonder if he never had or was interested in the education in that right area from Kane, because even then you can hear it. Any ideas? I think one of the problems is post-dubbing. I mean, Orson Welles made a lot of his more famous films after Touch of Evil, and before to a certain extent, things like Mr. Arkadin, where he had to post-dub the dialogue, and sometimes he'd had to travel to another country to do it. He was shoestring filmmaker in an incredible way. And yeah, sometimes the dialogue is off in Welles films, but the combination of the dialogue and the visuals really works for me. I think that he's one of those directors who, when he was scrambling to get his projects made, really didn't have the resources to do the dubbing as well as he might have liked to. And so he wanted to get the films out because, of course, that would pay for the next movie he wanted to make. And so there were things he had to kind of allow to pass. And I think that sometimes the dubbing was one of those things. It's a shame. It would have been nicer if he had crisper dubbing, if he had more precise dubbing, if he had more time in the studios doing the ADR to get the dialogue right with the actors and actresses he had. It would have been better. But it reflects more the limitations he was working through than the limitations he imposed on himself. Big Rat Killer says, one, chicken or fish? Depends on the kind of chicken, depends on the kind of fish. I like barramundi as a fish, fantastic fish to have. Blue grenadier is great. I like orange ruffy. Chicken, yeah, it depends on how it's cooked. I mean, I like a good spicy chicken. I like karaage, the Japanese style chicken. I like South Korean hot chicken. Depends. It's individual. Keith F says, hi Terry, so you're spending January 20 only watching movies you've never seen before. I'd be interested to know which movie you think you've seen more times than any other. Have a stab at how many times you might have watched it and why you kept returning to it, which, hey, might be that you like it, lol. P.S. I'll respond with my choice of films once you're giving your verdict. There are a few of them. I always go back to things like Young Girls of Rochford, which is one of my comfort films. I like The Bad and the Beautiful. It's one of my favourite movies, and 2 Weeks in Another Town. Both of those films I like a lot. I go back, if science fiction, I go back to The Core, the really wild movie with Aaron Eckhart, Hilary Swank and Stanley Tucci in it. That's a kind of weird comfort movie science fiction for me, even though the science is total shit in it. I'll go back to that. I don't know how many times I've watched those films. It's probably too much, and I could be filling that time with newer movies, but they're the ones I really kind of go back to. Let's see, Australian films. I've probably seen The Man from Hong Kong 5 or 6 times. Really like that Brian Trenchard Smith's masterpiece, which was filmed in Sydney when I lived in Sydney, so I know all the places where it was filmed, including the bits when they were on those fortifications on the shore. I used to hang around there when I was a kid. But yeah, there's so many of them. I've got no idea how often I've watched those films, but it's been probably a little bit too much. Jacob Martin says, what movie you initially hated at first but now you consider a great film or a masterpiece? Goes back to my last question. I saw Pauline Kael's review of The Young Girls of Rochford where she was disparaging of it and didn't understand it before I watched the movie. And because I've got such a respect for Pauline Kael as a film reviewer and critic, I didn't get Young Girls of Rochford at first. She said it was kind of a failed French attempt at doing a Hollywood musical, but over time I've come to see it as an homage to Hollywood musicals and to kind of embrace the joyous exuberance and creativity of that film. And it's one of my favourite movies of all time now. But the first time I saw it I kind of went meh, but then I watched it again and went, yeah, I understand this movie now. I can see what Jacques Demy is doing. I can embrace the wonderfulness of it. You got Francois Dorliac and Catherine Deneuve, you got George Chakiris, you've got Daniel Darrieux, you got Michelle Piccoli, you got Gene fucking Kelly in the movie. Yeah, I love it now, and that would be the one. Lee Bronx says, would it be possible to consider today's streaming and cable channel productions to be the modern version of the old studio system's B pictures? Yeah, definitely. There are some A pictures that are being put out by streaming services. But yeah, B pictures, absolutely. I mean, if you see them that way, a lot of people watch Netflix movies and expect all of them to be Citizen Kane, or at least at that level of wonderfulness. But yeah, there are a lot of B pictures that come out there. Things like Red Notice, that really shit movie with Dwayne Johnson, Gal Gadot, and Ryan Reynolds in it. That's a B picture with a big budget that's glossy as hell. Great special effects, but it's a crazily B picture movie. So yeah, they are. There's also a lot of grindhouse kind of cinema coming out from the streaming services as well. And I'm leaning into that increasingly as time goes on as well. Douglas Carter. I've been thinking a bit about science fiction movies and their history. Specifically, when did the majority of science fiction go from utopian to dystopian? 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the world realized that human beings could destroy the world. And it wouldn't be an act of God. It wouldn't be a random piece of nature, but we could actively do it to ourselves, is when dystopia really started to take hold in cinema. Also, yeah, that would be pretty much it. And also in majority of science fiction as well. It was a profound cultural shock to the planet to realise that one aeroplane dropping one bomb can destroy a city. In 2019, we went to Hiroshima, and I stood at ground zero in Hiroshima, right below where Enola Gay dropped the bomb. It was a moment. It was realising and looking up directly above myself and knowing that a nuclear weapon had been dropped there gave me a real understanding of that. And also there's a municipal building that they left the way it was after the bombing. And it's a solid building. It's like stone and steel. And it's been torn to shit by that nuclear blast. And it's in the middle of a beautiful peace park in Hiroshima now. So I've got a little bit of an idea of how profoundly shocking that moment in history was, and it has had a profound effect on science fiction ever since, and that's where the pivot point toward dystopia occurred. Now, there are utopian science fiction writers out there. Biggest one at the moment is Kim Stanley Robinson. His book Pacific Edge and his recent book, The Ministry for the Future, are unashamedly and complexly utopian. So utopia hasn't died out. It's just been overpowered by the pessimism of dystopia. Marcel Lazar says, your thoughts about Down by Law and Dead Man by Jim Jarmusch? I haven't seen them for a long time. I remember not being too impressed by Dead Man. Down by Law I saw ages ago. But I don't really have a strong enough opinion to have an informed opinion about it. I'm sorry about that. I will watch them, but at this stage, I don't have enough to kind of hang a comment off. Mark Colton says, what director do you think had the greatest positive influence on making movies, whether it be American, British, French, German, Russian, Japanese, or any other? I think Georges Méliès and the Lumiere brothers at the start of things. D.W. Griffith, for all of his sins, gave us a number of techniques, cross-cutting and fade-ins, fade-outs and close-ups and things like that. He was really profoundly influential on that. F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang, all of those UFA guys were incredibly influential as well. In the sound era, there are just so many of them. Hollywood was replete with people who were working under a system run by uneducated money men and yet still put out a lot of interesting product. I really like the French New Wave as well. I think that pivoted cinema and brought it back to grassroots in a lot of ways, and I really have a fondness for that. There's no one person. I mean, Hitchcock, of course, in the suspense area was fantastic, but Fritz Lang was doing pretty much a similar thing at pretty much a similar time. Though Fritz Lang might have started a little bit earlier. I like Billy Wilder's stuff in cinema because it brought a European complexity to American cinema, which it sorely needed. There are just so many of them. That migration of European filmmakers to Hollywood in the 1930s is probably one of the best things that happened to Western cinema, at least. I like Yasujiro Ozu. I think that he gave us a cinema which is about people who felt real, and he did it at the Tamimat level. He always had that kind of low angle level and framed people beautifully in shots. I think that Ozu's contribution to cinema is that it reminded us that it's not always about escapism. and sometimes it's about the lives of human beings. And I really have an increasing respect for his work as well. Brad Bazanka has another question. Hello Terry, I've been catching up with a lot of William Castle films lately. I was wondering what your thoughts about him were. There's plenty of films across many genres. While known mostly for his later films, there were some real gems in his earlier work. I'd love to see an entire episode on him, his work, and your favourite films of his, if any. Thanks for the great channel. Stay well. Yeah, there are so many good ones. I mean, I was looking over his filmography, and there are all those Whistler films he did in the 1940s when he was working for the studio. Serpent of the Nile is an interesting one with Rodney Fleming, Raymond Burr, and Michael Ansara in it. Slaves of Babylon, which had Richard Conte and Linda Christian in it. Yeah, his early stuff is really interesting. They were all kind of low budget. Hollywood Story, 1951. That one's really interesting with Richard Conte and Julie Adams in it, which is set on the old Charlie Chaplin film lot in Hollywood just before it got ripped down. Interesting little film there. I know it's in a film noir box set that came out recently. But the stuff I know him for, I mean, things like Macabre from 1958 is really interesting with Jim Backus in it. And Homicidal from 1961, which was his twist on Psycho. And then you go back to The Tingler and 13 Ghosts and all those. Mr. Sardonicus is great. I want to find a DVD or Blu-ray copy of Zots. I know it's in a box set, but I want to get it as a standalone, so I don't have to buy all the other stuff. Nightwalker in 1964 with Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor in it is kind of an interesting one as well. And The Spirit is Willing, and probably the last one of his I really like as a director is Project X with Christopher George in it. That one's kind of fun. Tries to tell a big story about the future using a very, very low budget and using some Hanna-Barbera animation. That one's kind of fun too. So yeah, I like William Castle stuff. I even like Matinee, the Joe Dante movie, which is based on William Castle, with John Goodman playing Lawrence Woolsey. That one's fun too. But yeah, I mean, William Castle, you've got to love somebody that leans into low budget and exploitation before it was fashionable to do so, and he definitely did that. What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow, says Brian Edwards? Depends on whether you're at sea level, whether you're up on top of a mountain. Depends on humidity, depends on wind resistance, it depends on how recently the swallow ate. Too many variables to answer that question effectively. What are your top picks for pre-code films and silent films? Pre-code films, there are a lot of them. I mean, any of the pre-code films are interesting that came out of Hollywood. Silent films, I'm leaning towards the Germans on this. Things that came out from UFA, Nosferatu, and all of Fritz Lang's stuff from the 1920s, like Spione and the Dr. Mabuse film, Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, and of course Metropolis and Frau im Mond, and all of those ones I really like a lot. Murnau's movies as well. So those are kind of where my jam is. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, just those German expressionist things which were moving the genre along in some interesting ways. M, the Fritz Lang movie M, is just, it was remade in 1951, but geez, that's a solid film. It's perfection in what it does. And Peter Lorre was never creepier than he was playing the child killer. I'm going to finish up with my good friend Morris from See Here Podcast. And yeah, we've got to catch up for another coffee soon, mate. Who says, aside from The Last New Wave, now I've got show and tell here, which is this book by David Stratton, which is all about 1970s Australian cinema. Thanks for providing me with a copy, says Morris, because I gave him my spare copy. What other books on the history of Australian cinema would I recommend? Hopefully ones that are in print, real or ebook. Can't promise that, but I'll show you what I've got. We've got the one about 80s and 90s Australian cinema done by David Stratton as well. The Avocado Plantation, Boom and Bust in the Australian Film Industry. This one's hard to find, just like The Last New Wave is. But it's solid, and David is the guy to talk about Australian cinema. He is just such a legend in Australian cinema circles. He was involved in the Sydney Film Festival in the 60s, and he's still talking about movies to these days. Now, I've got 5, I think, movie books here about Australian cinema, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say you can't find, but they're interesting to look at. This one from about 1970 is John Baxter's book, The Australian Cinema, which has got a picture of Ed Devereaux, Chips Rafferty, Walter Chiari, and John O'Grady from the making of They're a Weird Mob. This is a nice history of Australian cinema up until 1970, and it goes into things like the way that state and federal governments in the 1920s basically killed off the Australian film industry by cutting deals with Hollywood. There's a story to be told in that. There's this one by Diane Collins, Hollywood Down Under, Australians at the Movies, 1896 to the present day, which is about 1980. And this is about how Australians watch movies. And it's got a lot of cool pictures of cinemas and things like that. That one by Angus and Robertson's publishers is a nice view about how Australians went to the movies from 1896 onwards. Brian McFarlane, Real and Real, The Education of a Film Obsessive and Critic. Brian McFarlane's a fine Australian movie reviewer and aficionado, and he's got a nice history there of his career as a movie buff, which is really a nice read as well. I like that one as well. William K. Halliwell's The Film Goer's Guide to Australian Films. This is another Angus and Robertson one from back in the day, which has got some interesting tidbits about Australian cinema. It's got basically it's about Australian actors and filmmakers and things like that. It's not a lot of detail, but it'll tell you about the movies themselves somewhat. By the way, if you can hear rain, it's just started raining. And this big chungus, which is John Stewart's An Encyclopedia of Australian Film, which is almost a picture book as well. Again, it's just got kind of biographical bits about people in Australian cinema and about the movies. Probably nothing in here you couldn't really get from IMDb, though you may get a few more details. But I like it. It's a useful book if you want to look up who a certain actor was at a certain time. And it goes up till about 1980 and has a lot of actors that you'll see in exploitation films. It gives you a lot more detail about them. So it's useful from that point of view. And it's got pictures of Australian actors on the back.
Okay, last question from Bill Sinkins. What movie or movies did you go into wanting to like, but the movie disappointed you? One of my examples is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy from 2005. I love the books and love the miniseries of Simon Jones as Arthur Dent. I was looking forward to the film version, but it was a huge disappointment. I hated Arthur being played as a lovesick puppy rather than an indignant put-upon Englishman. Zooey Deschanel is given absolutely nothing to do. The only performance I liked was Mos Def as Ford Prefect. I can't really think of any because I've got this thing where I differentiate books from movies. I know in most cases movies are going to stuff up the books, so I've split them off as different things. There's none that I really have a real hatred for. I've talked to enough writers to know that they take the money and run in most cases when their literary works are adapted to the screen. You've really got to separate the two, even when it is something which is innately asking for a movie or visual adaptation, the same way that the radio plays of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy did. But for me, I differentiate quite easily. If I like the book and the adaptation of the book isn't that great, as in the Tom Cruise Jack Reacher movies, I just kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to watch it, but I'm not expecting much. So if you keep your expectations low, occasionally they'll be exceeded, but in most cases you're kind of guarding yourself against disappointment, and that's kind of what you need to do with these kind of adaptations. So that's the last of the questions, and that is the end of the video. So thank you very much for watching. As always, please consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. You can also support the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. I really enjoy these questions, so thank you very much to everybody who asked them. The community tab is an interesting place at the best of times, and you guys have really brought it home for me. So watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, always ask questions about movies, and I'll catch you next time.